They thought Berlin would starve. American planes proved them wrong. When World War II ended in 1945, the guns fell silent, but peace did not truly arrive in Europe. The continent was shattered, its cities in ruins, its economies broken, and its people exhausted. Out of the wreckage emerged a fragile alliance between former wartime partners who no longer trusted one another. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in Germany, and especially in Berlin, a city defeated, divided, and surrounded. Though Berlin lay deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, it was split into sectors governed by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. What was meant to be a temporary administrative arrangement soon became one of the most dangerous fault lines of the Cold War. As relations between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union deteriorated, Berlin became more than a city. It became a symbol. To the West, it represented a commitment to freedom and reconstruction. To the Soviet Union, it was an ideological threat planted in the heart of their zone of influence. By 1947 and early 1948, distrust had hardened into open confrontation. The United States launched the Marshall Plan, offering economic aid to rebuild Europe and stabilize democratic governments. The Soviets viewed this not as charity, but as an attempt to expand American influence. When the Western Allies introduced a new currency in their zones of Germany, including West Berlin, Moscow decided it was time to act. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet Union made its move. Without warning, all rail, road, and canal access to West Berlin was cut off. Trains were stopped. Highways were sealed. Barges were turned away. Electricity generated outside the city was shut down. More than 2 million civilians were suddenly isolated, with no steady supply of food, coal, fuel, or medicine. The blockade was a calculated act of pressure, designed to force the Western Allies out of Berlin without firing a single shot. Soviet leaders believed they had found the perfect weapon: starvation. They were convinced that the United States and its allies would not risk a new war over a city that could not possibly be supplied. Inside West Berlin, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food rations dropped to bare survival levels. Coal shortages left homes cold and dark. Factories shut down. Hospitals struggled to function. Winter loomed, and with it the very real possibility of mass suffering. Many expected panic, unrest, and eventually surrender. The Soviet Union believed time was on its side. In Washington, the decision was agonizing. Sending ground forces through the blockade risked immediate war with the Soviet Union. Abandoning Berlin would shatter American credibility across Europe and signal that intimidation worked. President Harry S. Truman understood what was at stake. Berlin was not just a city, it was a test. If the United States failed here, the balance of power in Europe would tilt decisively toward Moscow. Truman made a choice that defied conventional military logic. Instead of retreating, and instead of fighting, the United States chose to fly. The idea was bold to the point of seeming impossible: supply an entire city by air alone. Berlin required thousands of tons of supplies every single day just to survive, especially coal to generate electricity and heat. Aircraft would have to operate non-stop, through narrow air corridors agreed upon years earlier, flying over hostile territory, landing in crowded airports with almost no room for error. Many experts said it could not be done. Some predicted disaster within weeks. The Soviets were confident the effort would collapse under its own weight. But on June 26, 1948, American cargo planes began arriving in Berlin. At first, the numbers were small. C-47 transport aircraft carried modest loads of food and medical supplies. It was not nearly enough. But the operation grew rapidly. Larger C-54 Skymasters replaced smaller aircraft, carrying heavier loads more efficiently. Pilots flew in darkness, fog, rain, and snow. They followed rigid schedules, landing every few minutes, unloading at record speed, and taking off again almost immediately. Ground crews worked around the clock, exhausted but relentless. Every delay was measured in hunger. Every mistake could cost lives. As weeks turned into months, the Berlin Airlift became a machine of precision. Air traffic controllers choreographed an endless ballet of aircraft. Planes landed in Berlin at intervals sometimes as short as 90 seconds. At its peak, the operation ran 24 hours a day without pause. When existing airfields became overwhelmed, A new airport was built in the French sector of Berlin in record time. Runways were extended, systems refined, procedures perfected. What had begun as a desperate gamble became a demonstration of logistical mastery. For the people of Berlin, the sound of engines overhead became the sound of survival. The skies were never silent. Aircraft delivered coal, flour, dried milk, fuel, and medicine. They also delivered something less tangible but just as vital: hope. Children gathered near the runways, watching the planes descend. One American pilot began dropping small parachutes made from handkerchiefs, carrying candy for the children below. Others followed. These small gestures became legendary, a human connection forged in the shadow of global tension. The Soviet Union watched as its strategy failed. The blockade did not weaken Western resolve. It strengthened it. Berlin did not starve. Instead, it endured. Month after month, the airlift continued, growing larger, faster, and more efficient. At its height, the operation delivered nearly 13,000 tons of supplies in a single day, more than the city had received daily by land before the blockade. What was meant to break Berlin instead exposed a fatal miscalculation. The United States would not leave. The cost was not zero. Aircraft crashed. Pilots and crew lost their lives. The pace was brutal, the pressure immense. Yet the operation never stopped. Discipline, coordination, and resolve carried it forward. This was not a victory won with bombs or bullets, but with persistence and planning. In May 1949, after nearly 11 months of failure, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade. No concessions had been gained. No surrender had occurred. West Berlin still stood, supplied, defiant, and firmly tied to the Western world. The airlift continued for months afterward to ensure stability, ending only when it was clear the city could sustain itself. By the time it was over, more than 2 million tons of supplies had been delivered by air. The Berlin Airlift became one of the first great victories of the Cold War, not because territory was conquered, but because freedom was defended without triggering war. The Soviet Union had believed Berlin would starve. American planes proved them wrong. The Cold War would go on for decades. It would be fought in jungles, deserts, skies, and seas. But one of its earliest and most decisive battles was fought in the air above Berlin, where resolve outflew fear and endurance defeated intimidation. Berlin did not fall, and the world learned what American commitment truly meant.